Okay, wow. That makes me feel important. Is it better with this? Yeah? Okay. If it makes you feel better, I feel better. Okay. Thank you, lovely. So it's been a shit few years. I think it's probably safe to say. And there's a lot of energy in this room. We're talking about things that are very emotive. We're talking about work that impacts people's lives. The conversations we're having around strategies are like very charged, and I kind of want to acknowledge that and acknowledge that, you know, a lot of the beautiful speeches and films and talks that have happened today have potentially been maybe not triggering, but potentially quite stimulating in a way that can be a lot to handle. So I just want everyone to start by just taking a deep breath in and out with me. So just I feel like that's solved everything, right? Capitalism is fine now, I feel. I mean, okay, I think we'll start by thinking about where we are today. So, obviously, don't know if you've heard, there's been a pandemic. It's been pretty bad. We've seen social murder by the state on a mass scale during the pandemic through its lack of provision. Violence from the police forces. I don't think it's probably true to say that it's increased, but it has become much more visible. We've had the case of Child Q come to light and the violences in schools through the policies of exclusion, the school to prison pipeline, through the legalized sexual harassment of children by the police force through strip searches, mainly black and Asian girls. We've still got the detention of Muslim children under the age of 10, hundreds within a few year period pre-pandemic under the PREVENT program. We've had the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act come into force, which criminalizes, among other things, robust protest, potentially at the discretion of the police, criminalizes strike action, criminalizes trespass more than it has been so far, can take away the homes and the children of people from GRT communities, that's Gypsy, Roma, and traveller communities. During the pandemic, things, as we've already heard, have been horrendous for migrants, particularly undocumented migrants. At Napier Barracks, which was used as a detention centre, and I think is still maybe being used as a detention centre, we had the police violence against protesters. We had a migrant who escaped being forced back into a COVID non-secure environment. And since we've gone back to the new normal, we've also seen the Nationality and Borders Act come into force. The further criminalization of migration, the further entrenchment of hard borders, the many more drownings that we've seen in the most dangerous sea crossing on earth, which is the Mediterranean, not just here, but in Calais, in Lesbos, in the islands of Greece. We've also seen the attempt to ship migrants off to Rwanda, which has been delayed, but which is still happening. And I think it's probably more evident than ever that the police violence on our streets that we've seen is not separate from the violence of the border regime. So to that extent, when we remember Mercy Baguma, who was a migrant in Glasgow, who was starved to death by the asylum system and whose body was found by her crying baby, we also have to remember the police violence against Sarah Everard. When we remember how the police took photos of the corpses of Bieber Henry, Nicole Smallman, of how they responded to the uprising in 2011 after the murder of Mark Duggan. When we remember the complete lack of justice for Shukri Abdi, the school child who was killed. We also have to remember Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who was detained for several years due to British trade policy in Iran. We also have to remember Jagtar Singh Johal, who's a political prisoner and British national, who's been detained in India for 5 years, again, because of British trade policy. And of course, we remember the migrants that continue to be detained and continue to face deportation. So that's where we're at. pretty shit, as I've said. But of course, that's one half of the story. My friend earlier was talking about power, about what it means to have power, where we find it, where we locate it. And it's also important, as much as we have to have a sober analysis of where we are now, to also remember that actually there is a thriving attempt at every level of society to consistently beat back this onslaught that is coming from the state and from the borders and the police. So in Peckham, in June, we saw an immigration raid frustrated despite the police violence. It was incredible. I was there, and the solidarity that I experienced was something that gave me so much hope. The feeling of standing up for someone in our community and seeing them set free. Later on, we had stop deportations who managed to delay the coaches leaving detention centres that were taking migrants to the flight to Rwanda. That was stopped for long enough for appeals through the courts to be successful, so that the scheduled flight had to be grounded and never took off. We've also seen from Palestine Action disruptive actions against Elbit Systems, which is an arms company. It's Israel's largest arms company, and it supplies not only Israel, but markets its weapons as tested on the people of Gaza, and sells them to Brazil and to India in the occupation of Kashmir. Palestine Action have driven them out of London by smashing up the offices. There was some discussion earlier about protest and about its efficacy. I firmly believe in an ecology of movements, and part of that is just smashing shit up. And it can also work. We've also seen disruptive actions by groups like Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain, by Green New Deal Rising, invading boardrooms. We've also obviously got the RMT strikes. We've got the strikes from the Communication Workers Union, the National Education Union balloting for strike, UCU, the University and Colleges Union, on strike action. We've got a comrade over there who's been on strike for so long, it's actually seeming more and more attractive to me. And we saw British Airways workers in their victory at Heathrow recently when they were threatening strike action. We've got PCS, the Public Sector Union, balloting for strike action in September. We've got the Don't Pay campaign, which is a mass non-payment campaign that started up, and there's some leaflets over there in relation to the cost of living crisis. And so it's really important, I think, to remember that as bad as things seem to be to us, and they are bad, these moments of resistance are ongoing. They have never stopped. Marginalized people have always been engaged in this constant struggle to give themselves lives of dignity, and that struggle is still continuing. And I think it's really important when we have conversations about strategy not to forget that however sober our analysis is, the fact that we're doing this, the fact that we're resisting the constant demands not to recognize one another as human, the fact that we're constantly resisting atomization and alienation that comes as part of wage labor, that is an incredibly beautiful thing. I'm going to have a sip of water. So, in relation to that, I guess, during the past few months, in particular since the immigration raid in Peckham, but also during a recent action that we took with Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants, I realise I haven't said actually, I am here with Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants. Yes, represent comrades. And for those of you who don't know, Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants is a solidarity organisation that is inspired by movements like Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, which were a collective of queer people who expressed solidarity materially and through organising with the miner strikers. So that's kind of where we kind of draw our legacy of solidarity from. We took a recent action during London Pride, where we stormed Pride essentially in protest at the presence of the police. And there's been various other actions as well. And what's been going round and round in my head, and I spoke about this the last time I saw Shama, so I'm sorry if it sounds like a broken record, is an old Pakistani Punjabi poem. So my family are Punjabi, but they're from East Punjab, Indian Punjab. But this poem was written by a poet called Habib Jalib. So he was a progressive, he was sort of an anti-capitalist, and he wrote it at a time when there had been a military coup in Pakistan. And the lines of it, I will translate these, so don't worry. The first lines of it are, Deep jiska mahalla tahi mein tale, chand logon ki khushiyon ko le char kale, wo jo साए के हर मसलहत के पले, ऐसे दस्तूर को सुबह बेनूर को, मैं नहीं मानता, मैं नहीं जानता. And what he's saying there is that light that burns in the palaces of the rich, it draws itself from the oil, from the mud huts and slums of the poor. Such a system, like dawn without light, I do not acknowledge. I refuse to accept. And when we were surrounding the immigration van in Peckham at the beginning of June, and when we were running away from the police on Pride, that was what was going through my head. Main nahi manta, main nahi janata. And in the context of what it means to think about queerness, given all the shit that we've just outlined, what does it mean to talk about a queer identity or a queer collective identity in the face of so much violence? The answer that I keep coming towards is that same refrain, main nahi manta, main nahi janata. And there's something in that, I think, about queerness, conceptualizing queerness as a political project of refusal, for a start. Queerness not as something that we should think about as just being non-normative or at odds with the norm or the system or structures or whatever else, but queerness that is a direct refusal of those structures. And I think it's useful bearing in mind when we think about how progress happens. So an example of this might be that gay marriage getting passed is obviously an incredible thing just for people's day-to-day lives, right? Gay marriage, I should say, sorry. That is a good thing. What happened to the gay liberation movement in Britain post that is that it sort of disintegrated for a long time. Obviously, there was still queer resistance, but at that point, the conception of queerness as something that was an alterity, a little bit off, had been assimilated because now you have marriage just like us. But the political project of gay liberation and of queer resistance historically started with the street queens, or not quite started with the street queens, but definitely involved organizing with sex workers. It definitely involved organizing with drug users. It definitely involved organizing with homeless people, with people who are genderqueer and trans, as well as cisgender and gay or lesbian. It has always been a coalition in that sense of those who have been at odds and who have been let go by the social structures that we are now being assimilated into. And so if we hold on with that to a rejection of the system that leaves queer and trans people disproportionately likely to end up homeless or to be subject to domestic violence in some instances, to be subject to conversion therapy, to be subject to hate crimes for the way they dress, for the way they talk, for the way that they present. If we want to actually continue to build a radical queer tradition that recognizes that, it can't come from a sense of being like, we're almost just like you. Queerness in that regard also, though, can't just be about having a set of codified desires where if you tick these boxes, that's fine, you're in the club. There's a reconceptualization of queerness that happens in queer studies, or has happened, led by people like Jack Halberstam, which talks about thinking about queerness not just as a matter of who you like to fuck or don't, but a matter of who you're bringing along with you in that political coalition. In that sense, what does it mean to think of other people who are marginalized as part of a queer political project? We can consider migrants, particularly undocumented migrants, potentially as part of this queer coalition. We can think about those who are disciplined by the state for expressing outrage in uprisings that are referred to as riots as part of a queer coalition. They don't all have to wear the pride badge. They don't all have to fly a rainbow flag. But what are we doing when we talk about queerness if it's not to bring that kind of a coalition together? Because fundamentally, the dream of gay liberation, and the dream that many of us still hold, is a world without sexuality. That doesn't mean a world where no one fucks. I don't want that. That means a world in which the way that we codify bodies and codify desires is completely unnecessary, because we can accept that the ways that we relate to one another are so beautiful, so infinitely varied, and just sometimes really kinky that you just don't need to have a particular label for it. And in that regard, from a queer political perspective, when we talk about the need, for example, to recognize genders that are not binary, are we asking for an extra tick box on a passport for people who are non-binary? Or are we arguing and agitating for the abolition of passports and borders? A political project of refusal, if that's how we understand queerness, is at once invested in building towards a world in which it will abolish itself, a world in which to be queer as something that is not the norm doesn't mean anything, because those systems and codes don't exist. But in the short term, it recognizes the necessity of it as a political coalition, queerness as a doing word, both in the sexy sense and also in every other sense. So when we think about how we're organizing towards a world in which we're trying to abolish ourselves, and along with ourselves, a world in which we're trying to abolish borders, the prison industrial complex, carceral systems of punishment, a world where we're trying to abolish the police and the military, I think it's important to recognize that the ways in which we organize today are prefiguring the world that we want to build. This is why questions of tactics and strategy that can seem very alienating, dominated by theory bros, unfortunately do matter, because the ways that we're organizing is directly building towards that world that we're imagining. And that's why I think sometimes it can feel so emotional, and the stakes can feel so high. I'm gonna have another sip of water. So thinking about the ways in which we organize, I joined Lesbians and Gay Support the Migrants in 2017. I followed someone who I thought was really fit, and I was like, what are you doing? And they said, I'm going to this cool, edgy, like radical queer solidarity group. And I was like, great, cool, love migrants, take me along. Turns out I do love migrants. And I went there, and it was the first queer space I'd ever been in. This is back in 2017, sort of baby gay. And it was just a bunch of people sitting down and chatting about some stuff we could do to make the world better. Sounds a bit trite. Obviously, there are theories of change behind it. Obviously, that's not the full story. But fundamentally, that's where it started for me, as it starts for so many others, with a relationality, with feeling at home and not quite comfortable, but something approaching comfortability. That experience of that space is somewhere where I could make mistakes and say stupid stuff, where I could be vulnerable, and where I could just start participating immediately in conversations that I was so ill prepared for, about what we should be doing as a group, about what our politics were, about what actions were the most necessary, about what the purposes of those actions were. Just being welcomed and being allowed to make those mistakes, to be part of the collective, has completely shaped my politics and also completely shaped my queerness. And I think there's something in that method of organizing, which is, we call it horizontal organizing. You lot can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, by the way. It basically means that you don't have someone designated as making decisions. The decisions are made by the collective. The collective is malleable and permeable. It changes depending on who actually wants to turn up for a Monday meeting, basically. And there's something in that about prefiguring a different world, which kind of has really defined how I think about solidarity. There was absolutely nothing about that space that was transactional. It wasn't the case that if someone said, oh, I'm going to check the emails this week or something, that someone else would be like, oh, well, now I kind of have to do this as an obligation. People did what they could when they could because they wanted to do it. And it worked. I mean, the things that LGSM has done, and a lot of this has not involved me, I should say, when you think about it as a model of organizing that just involves people who aren't professional activists, but who are just people who become activists or organizers in that sense, because that's what we call people who do stuff. In 2018 or 2019, Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants occupied the I-360 building in Brighton because it was sponsored by weapons manufacturers BAE Systems, as was Brighton Pride. The same year, Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants stormed a Borders and Airlines dinner and gave out sick bags saying deportations made us sick. Again, 2019 was a busy year. I wish I'd been around for that. I dipped out for a bit. Stormed the Saatchi Gallery for an exhibit that was on the future of flying, I think, which was sponsored by British Airways, who at the time, and I think perhaps still, had contracts with the Home Office for deportations. Earlier on in 2017, there was a die-in at the front of Pride to protest the presence of the army. And what does this one say? Can't read my own writing. 2020, Occupy the back of Pride and opened it up to let anyone take part, because at the moment that's not how it works. And this year, we held a die-in for 23 minutes in front of the Metropolitan Police, who were marching in Pride. In response to a campaign we'd ran, Pride had said that they wouldn't be allowed to march in uniform, but they were still marching. We stood there in solidarity with survivors and victims of police violence, and we stayed there for a minute for every death in police custody in the last year. But it's not all direct action stuff. It's not all storming buildings and occupying galleries and like yelling at Pride in London, although that's my favorite part. It's also about the care work that goes into it. Part of that involves bucket shaking in Soho to kind of attempt to repoliticize queer spaces that have so easily assimilated into this kind of capitalist gay utopia. It's also involved doing interpersonal care work with each other to try to put structures and systems in place to make sure that we are looked after and we're caring for one another. It's also involved getting Virgin Airlines to stop doing deportation flights. It's involved public-facing stuff. It's involved, you know, fake names and private messaging stuff. It's run the whole gamut of all of it, including throwing parties, obviously. And I think sometimes when we think about theories of change and what it kind of takes to change the world in that sense, my world has been changed by participating in a movement like this. This is not just a vehicle. It's something that I really want to emphasize. These structures that we create condition us in the same way that the state conditions us towards violence, in the same way that the police condition us towards violence. The organizing spaces that we construct condition us either towards care or towards a transactional identitarian solidarity. And this again is why it's really important when we think about the world we're trying to build towards. It's one thing to build our own power, but power isn't something that you take and use at some point in like a linear way at some point in the future to achieve a certain end. Power is something that we're constantly wielding over each other, and we have to be extremely mindful of that. It's important to have a broad ecology, I think, of people who have different approaches to building our power, but it's always important to locate the thrust of that primarily, not in the institutions, and not in lobbying, but actually in the ordinary people who are maybe meeting in the back room of a pub or a community building that's about to be knocked down that has a spare space, and caring for one another and just collectively imagining a better world. Now, as part of that, I forgot my little paper thing actually. Can someone pass me the Homo Office leaflet, please? Thank you. As part of that, LGSM recently launched the Homo Office. I'm just going to read from this what it is. There are some leaflets, but I think it probably does a better job explaining it than me ad-libbing on here. So, all right. Okay, I feel like stand up. The energy in this room is a little bit low. I've been talking a lot about like capitalism and bad stuff, but stand up, come on. Up. All right, so Britain has a long history of racist, elitist, and dangerous migration policies. In 2012, the Home Office took this to a new level, unashamedly announcing the hostile environment, a set of policies that purport to deter migrants by making the UK a hostile place to come. I'm interjecting on our leaflet here just to recognise that even though the hostile environment is a conservative policy, the term hostile environment actually comes from the Labour Party campaign for Tony Blair's second term, which was run on the idea of making Britain a hostile environment for asylum seekers, so it wasn't seen as being weak on crime. So we were talking earlier about what we can do by getting people with the right ideology into power. We need to recognise this is what happens to that ideology when it becomes in proximity to power. The hostile environment has made the UK unsafe for people already living here, for people who want to move here, and for those who need to come here to seek refuge. We've seen 10 years of ramped up deportations, detention, criminalisation, manufactured poverty, willful neglect, and institutional racism that have directly led to the deaths of so many people. After the passing of the Nationality and Borders Bill, we know it's only going to get worse. The Home Office is a racist, queerphobic institution that is killing people. So we're taking matters into our own hands. We are the Homo Office, and this is our manifesto. And I'd like to invite you to think about maybe getting involved in this alternative institution. Fuck borders. The Homo Office believes that borders equal death. We reject the government's narrative of good versus bad migrants. Everyone should be free to move where they want to live, regardless of their identity, reason for moving, or financial status. Borders are made up anyway. Fuck them. No one is illegal. The Homo Office would not force people into precarious positions by deeming them illegal. It is currently impossible to seek asylum in the UK without arriving by so-called illegal methods and then applying to be accepted. Deportations and detention centres are inhumane. There should be no burden of proof for people seeking refuge in the UK. Abolish the prison industrial complex. That should be an easy one, I think, right? The Homo Office seeks to build a future without prisons, police, and punishment. The prison industrial complex is a set of for-profit initiatives that cause harm to everyone in society, especially people of colour, migrants, queer people, women, neurodiverse people, and people with other marginalised identities. The Homo Office would redistribute the funds from the prison industrial complex towards community support initiatives, creating a society that prioritises care and accountability over punishment and profit. Queer solidarity. The Homo Office believes that for true liberation, none of us are free until all of us are free. We are committed to standing in solidarity with other people who experience institutional discrimination under the laws of the UK government and across the world. Together, we are the majority. Slay. Yeah, some noise for the Homo Office, please. We can sit down now. I feel like that line, none of us are free until all of us are free, is when you hear a lot of protests, and it is one that always gets me. I'm a massive softie, but it does. And I think part of that is, realizing that we don't organize in solidarity with migrants because some migrants are queer, right? We don't organize because some queer people are subject to detention or deportation or no recourse to public funds or have to submit sex tapes in order to prove their sexuality when they're claiming asylum. That's not why we organize in solidarity with migrants. It is that simple, that it's because none of us are free until all of us are free. And that simple statement that just encapsulates the movement that we are trying to build, however much we disagree on tactics or policy. What we're all collectively doing, what we're all doing by being in this room, is resisting a world that tells you that you should only look out for yourself. The attempt constantly that we're engaged in of creating a society built on collectivity, a society in which we do care for one another, in which we don't accept that we're atomized, in which we keep refusing to acknowledge the structures that are handed down to us. That is the work that Lesbians and Gay Support the Migrants is involved in. I kind of want to very quickly as well just kind of mention the Home Office a bit more, because this is a kind of artsy space, right? I'm not really from like an artsy world, but I know people here are from an artsy world, and I think that's cool. I think, bearing in mind what I've said about the ways in which we organize, constructing the political horizons that are subsequently available to us, I think it's a fair question to say it might be funny, but why start an initiative that mimics the same institution that you're saying needs to be abolished, right? And I think the argument would be, what it ties into, is that the first thing is that the subject of the joke is itself the institution. The parodying it isn't something that reinscribes it, it's something that subverts it. And the other thing I would say is that a rejection of the way that the Home Office is currently structured doesn't mean that we think there is a Home Office that is just or fair, right? At the same time, we do organize with specific demands, like my friend earlier was talking about. There are specific policy changes that would make the Home Office more humane, less violent, less destructive. It will always produce violence. It will always destroy, because that is the nature of borders. But these are the transitional demands that activists are currently organizing around. If we weren't organizing around transitional demands at the moment, we'd be, I don't know, building bridges over the channel. I actually have no practical skills, but there'd be something physical you can do, I'm sure, to smash up a border, right? So I think it is important to recognize that the work that we are engaged in, which is often seen as kind of utopian or maybe not necessarily grounded in what is pragmatic, actually this is our pragmatism. And it's an expansive pragmatism, all the more expansive because it's built on a utopian, explicitly ideological view of a world which puts people first. And from a queer perspective, starts with something very simple: a refusal to accept, a refusal to acknowledge. Men nahi manata, men nahi janata. I don't know how long that's been. Is that fine? Cool. Are there any, I don't know, do people have questions about the Home Office, about LGSM? Like, yeah. That's a really good question. How do people get involved? There are meetings. I believe that if you DM us on socials, so LGS Migrants is on Instagram and on Twitter and Facebook, I think, if you're old, and email, yeah. That's that intergenerational organizing we were talking about earlier. Just message us if you want to come to a meeting, and we'll respond as soon as we can. We also, oh yeah, we have T-shirts. Where are the T-shirts? Are they over there? I feel like someone has to hold them up. I can't really just be like, there are T-shirts. They might be shit, do you know what I mean? Thank you, Eliel. Eliel is going to hold up the T-shirts that we're selling. So one big part of the work we do with LGS Migrants is we fundraise. So not just through bucket shakes, but through bigger campaigns. And we funnel those funds often towards organizations that directly work with migrants or are themselves migrant-led. So if you buy what I'm sure is like a very sexy item of clothing, here we go. Look at that. Queer Solidarity Smashes Borders. That's the first one. And then I believe we have another one, which... Oh, do we just have the same one? No, we do have another one, because I just acquired one. And it has the amazing phrase on it, which was like the first time that I started thinking about queerness, not as an identity, but as a kind of practice, which is not gay as in happy, queer as in fuck your borders. If you want to buy them, I can't remember how much they are, but Eliel is selling them, and the funds will go towards... Do you remember what charity it is this time? I've forgotten.
Rainbow Family, and I think it's primarily African Rainbow Family for them to attend Black Pride.
Yeah, so fundraising for African Rainbow Family to attend Black Pride. Yeah, and any other questions? No, I kind of like messed that bit up. So no, but yeah. Otherwise, I think we're good. All right. Thank you so much for having me.